All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today. We have a wonderful conversation about to unfold. My terrific boss, Chris Costa, the Executive Director of the International Spy Museum, will be leading the discussion, and he's joined today by Ambassador Nathan A. Sales, who recently served as the Acting Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights at the U.S. Department of State. In that role, Nathan oversaw 9 bureaus and offices led by Senate-confirmed principals with the mission of preventing and countering threats to civilian security, including terrorism, mass atrocities, and violations of human rights and the rule of law. Concurrently, Sales served as ambassador at large and coordinator for counterterrorism, international counterterrorism matters, and led the State Department's Counterterrorism Bureau. He was also the Special Presidential Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS, leading U.S. relations with the 83-member coalition and the effort to ensure the lasting defeat of ISIS in the Middle East and around the world. And my oddly placed chuckle was that there is just so much that Nathan was doing. And I just cannot believe it. This is not even his complete bio at all, but just a tiny bit more. Sales was the architect of the landmark 2017 UN Security Council Resolution 2396 on terrorist travel and sanctions, and successfully pressed NATO to make counterterrorism a core alliance mission. Sales is presently a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, focusing on counterterrorism, security, democracy, and the rule of law and human rights. Now, after Chris and Nathan discuss what's on their minds, we'll turn the program over to you for your questions. And if you've been here before, you know to please type them in through the Q&A feature, and we will do the best that we can to answer them or get them answered by the experts. So before I turn this over to Chris, I want to share a very special thanks to our ongoing incredible sponsor, the Honorable Mary Beth Long. She serves on the International Spy Museum Board of Directors, and she just has been so supportive of the museum. And we can't thank her enough. We can't thank you, our audience, enough. So one thing there is enough of, and that is me. So I'm turning this over to Chris, and I will be back with questions later.
Amanda, thanks as always for the terrific introduction and the shout out to Mary Beth Long. I think she's tuning in today. No pressure, right? But we're very grateful for all of her support. And I must say before we kick this off that I'm really excited to have Ambassador Sales here. He's a friend. We worked together in the last administration, and it was an absolute pleasure for us to be in the policy trenches together. So let me kick off with the first story that I'm tracking very closely, and it's appropriate we kick off talking about Afghanistan because as I understand matters today in Washington, D.C., President Biden is going to talk about the Afghanistan withdrawal of U.S. troops, as well as what's going to happen with linguists, potentially former sources, individuals who have worked with the United States government. But the point I wanted to make today is the story that was placed in the Wall Street Journal just a couple of weeks ago that talked about an assessment suggesting that the United States, with our withdrawal, the Afghanistan government may only last a year or at worst 6 months. Some Western sources have cited their beliefs that the Afghan government can only maintain for 90 days or so as the Taliban presses on cities and built up areas across the country, particularly in the north. I don't know. I am not a soothsayer, but I would say the Afghanistan government is going to have a great struggle trying to counter the Taliban's future rule. That's what they're going to vie for, in my humble opinion. We'll see how this plays out. If the national or if the new assessment pans out, the Afghan government might not last 6 months. So we'll see. We'll watch that story certainly very, very closely. And we'll be talking about it in the coming months, I'm sure. It's very dynamic. The second story is counterintelligence related, and it's fascinating for me because it has to do with counterterrorism and espionage. So a woman linguist who was assigned to a special operations force in Erbil, which is northern Iraq, a U.S. special operations task force. As a linguist, she was trusted to have access to information on some of our clandestine assets. She passed that information, intelligence, classified U.S. intelligence, to an individual that she had built a relationship with in Lebanon. This Lebanese man has ties to Hezbollah. And of course, it's presumed that the U.S. targeting is related to militia groups that are working against the United States and the government Iraq. So this is particularly damning. She was sentenced to 23 years in prison. She's about 62 years old, so that's almost a life sentence. To pivot a little bit to terrorism and political violence, the first story I want to talk about is really important and it's relevant because we've been talking about racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism that turns into political violence, terrorism. So in Canada, there was a hit and run case that was perpetrated against innocent bystanders. There was a family of 10 getting ready to cross the street, and 4 of them were killed when a 20-year-old ran them down. The Canadian government not only chose and killed those 4 individuals, the Canadian government not only decided to press terrorism charges, but also murder charges and other charges related to hate. So this is something we are keeping our eyes on, this idea of violence perpetrated against religious groups and other factions is something that we have talked about in previous spy chats. Certainly we'll entertain questions on that if you have them. Also, we'll pivot to another terrorism story in Africa. So I've talked about terrorist activity in Central Africa recently. We've talked about West Africa. We've also talked about the Sahel countries, in particular Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. Why I flag a story that was reported in the Washington Post is because France, since 2014, has done very aggressive work against ISIS and Al Qaeda related networks. However, they are going to shut down the task force. It was called, or operation called Berkane, and they are going to establish some kind of other task force, but France is likely not going to commit the amount of resources they have to fight this particular fight in Africa. So that could pose a problem to Western countries that are concerned that some of this in time will create networks linked to Europe in particular. The French government has also reached out to other countries such as Sweden, as I recall, and other European countries to contribute to some kind of future task force. The United States is likely not going to commit forces to put pressure on these networks in Africa. Although the United States continues to provide logistics support, it continues to provide intelligence report. To pivot on detention issues, really interesting story that I know Ambassador Sales is deep on, but I will just touch upon the problem that we've talked about in previous spy chats, and it has to do with women and children that are being held in squalid refugee camps. These are women that were brides of ISIS fighters. Those fighters, many of them are dead. There are some 200 women from 11 European countries alone. That equates to about 650 children that are in these camps. Belgium, in particular, has agreed to take back and repatriate 13 women. Those women will likely be prosecuted, and their children will have an opportunity, 27 children, to come back to Belgium in particular, and obviously be provided some kind of social services, and their mothers will likely be tried. I think personally that is a good trend. Other European countries have not taken back their families. I think Denmark recently has as well. The point being, this continues to be a problem. And the reason Belgium decided to take these families back is because they recognize that ISIS is continuing to radicalize in these camps. The problem's not going to go away. It's a pay now rather than pay later dynamic, as well as essentially these camps like Al-Hol have turned into a mini, in quotes, a mini caliphate. So a lot of radicalization going on. The other story I'm not going to talk a lot about because I made reference to it, and President Biden is going to talk about some 18,000 Afghans, plus or minus, that have provided support to the United States for the past decades, linguists and people involved with other services to the United States government, presumably sources as well, need to be repatriated outside of Afghanistan because their lives are at risk. The Taliban are going to seek retribution. I've read some reporting that that continues even as we speak. Countries around the world are going to be asked to take some of these Afghans that have supported the United States. In particular, I've heard mention the United Arab Emirate, the state of Qatar. I've also heard Guam will also potentially take back some of these individuals. So Mr. Biden will talk about this afternoon. So that's something we should pay close attention to. I should say parenthetically, some 50,000 family members in Afghanistan will be affected by these moves. It's pretty extraordinary. And the last story, I don't usually have an opportunity to offer a really, really upbeat story, but I have one today. There's a congressional task force on American hostages and Americans wrongfully detained abroad that has stood up. It's a bipartisan effort to ensure that Congress has the necessary resources to help the United States hostage enterprise in our endeavor to bring home Americans that are wrongfully detained and held overseas. So I think that is a really positive trend, and I very much appreciate seeing that happen. The last point I'll make before I turn it over to Ambassador Sales is a book recommendation. I'm particularly excited about this book. I found it really interesting. And if there's an opportunity, I'll share a personal vignette about why I appreciate this story so much. But the book is called A Drop of Treason. I highly recommend it. This audience certainly knows that the United States is filled with stories of intelligence, leakers, whistleblowers, and a few traitors along the way. I encourage reading this book. I believe that Philip A.G., a former CIA officer, was in fact a traitor, but I encourage this audience to get his book, read it. It's an excellent narrative, and you decide for yourself what Philip A.G. was. He is now deceased, but what was he when he decided to expose CIA secrets? I'll turn it over to Ambassador Sales because we all are excited to hear from him. Nathan?
Well, thanks very much, Chris. First of all, for inviting me to participate in this conversation today. But more importantly, thanks for your friendship and leadership over the years on a range of national security issues. Like you said, we had a good band the first couple of years of the last administration, working a wide range of issues related to terrorism and hostages. And you were the lead guitarist, so it was a great pleasure for me to get to work with you and see you in action. So thanks for your leadership. Thanks also to Assistant Secretary Long, Mary Beth Long, for providing the support necessary for today's conversation, but also for this entire series. I watched a number of these from my dining room table, and they're always really exciting. So I know I've got a pretty high bar to clear. So hopefully we'll be able to do that, Chris, you and me today. There's three topics that I thought we might spend a little bit of time covering. The first is counterterrorism in Afghanistan post-withdrawal. The second is the recent uptick in strikes by Iran-backed militias in Iraq, and then the third is China and human rights. Let me get right into it with Afghanistan. As Chris laid out ably, the situation in Afghanistan is not good. If I were a betting man, I would not bet on it to get better. So what are the implications of that for our counterterrorism objectives? I think our policy goal in Afghanistan or anywhere around the world has to be preventing terrorists from gaining safe haven. We know that when terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, which retains a presence in Afghanistan, we know that when terrorist groups acquire territorial control, they begin plotting and then executing external operations that threaten the homeland. Al-Qaeda had safe haven in Afghanistan in the 90s, and the result was 9/11. ISIS had safe haven in Syria and Iraq, and the result was the attacks in Paris and Brussels in 2015 and 16. So the question then becomes, how do you accomplish that? How do you prevent territorial control? So the Biden administration is pursuing what they've described as an over-the-horizon approach, in which we do not take strikes with assets based in Afghanistan, but we bring them in from elsewhere in the region or elsewhere in the world when needed. Now that's a lot harder than it sounds. And Chris ended on an optimistic note. I'm afraid I'm going to start here on a rather pessimistic and grim note. For this to work, you need to base your strike assets someplace outside of Afghanistan. Where do you do that? Well, one option is the US military bases in the Persian Gulf. That raises a number of operational challenges, the first of which is it's a lot farther to fly from Qatar or the UAE or elsewhere in the Gulf. So that means you're consuming fuel on the way there and on the way back, which reduces your loiter time over the targets. There's also some diplomatic challenges because in order to fly from the Gulf into Afghanistan, you need to overfly other countries. And so you need to get their permission to use their airspace, principally thinking here of Pakistan. Another alternative would be to base your strike assets out of Central Asia, but that also raises diplomatic challenges. Do you ask Tajikistan or Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or one of the other Central Asian countries to host our assets? Maybe they say yes, but China and Russia are likely to have a view on a US military presence right on their doorsteps and might be expected to lean on these countries to politely decline a request from the United States. Pakistan, for its part, has already publicly ruled out hosting US bases. So the strike asset problem is a difficult one, and it's one that's going to require quite a bit of diplomatic heft to address. Another challenge with an over-the-horizon approach is gathering the necessary intelligence to actually carry out successful strikes. You need ISR, that's spy speak for drones, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets to find and fix the targets that you might want to hit, the Al-Qaeda leadership, the Al-Qaeda training camps. You need to establish a pattern of life. This isn't just taking one snapshot of a bad guy and then sending in the drones. The way it's done is much more methodical, developing a pattern of life. And this is done in order to minimize to an absolutely small level the risk of any damage to civilian infrastructure or civilian casualties. You're also going to need SIGINT capabilities to collect electronic communications, phone calls, texts, emails, and various other bits of electronic data. And you're probably going to need human intelligence networks on the ground as well to collect as much information as you can about the location and pattern of life of Al-Qaeda targets. Needless to say, these are the sorts of capabilities that get degraded or eliminated altogether as the US military retrogrades out of the country. So there is an alternative, and the alternative is not a heavy US boots on the ground presence, you know, the 100,000 plus force that characterized our initial involvement in Afghanistan or in Iraq. Instead, we could use a model that was perfected in Syria, the so-called by, with, and through model, in which we work heavily with local partners. And there's a division of labor. The United States provides assets that are uniquely ours and that no other country can match. Things like drones for reconnaissance, strike assets, intel collection, air power, training, advising and assisting, and so on, while the local partners on the ground do the brunt of the actual fighting in combat. That approach is the one that we're pursuing in Syria right now, and it seems to be producing fairly good results. I think we have several hundred, maybe 1,000, I can't remember the exact number right now, US soldiers in northeast Syria, and they're working with the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, to apply pressure to ISIS remnants, particularly in places like the Badia Desert, in order to prevent ISIS from reconstituting and resurging. That model is a viable one, I think, for Afghanistan, but for policy reasons, it appears that it's not in the cards, and we will be looking at an over-the-horizon approach instead. Let me move now to the situation in Iraq. We've seen in the past couple of months a pretty dramatic increase in strikes by Iran-aligned Shia militias in Iraq, targeting US military bases and targeting our diplomatic presence in Iraq with weapons that range from relatively unsophisticated mortars and rockets on the one hand to fairly sophisticated explosive drones that they receive from their friends, shall we say, in Tehran, drones that are capable of evading detection and evading US defenses. So what's going on here? Let me try and break this down. The militias, as I said, the first thing you need to know about them is they're Iranian proxies. They take direction from the regime in Tehran, and the regime also supplies them with weapons, including those drones I mentioned. So why is it in the interest of these militias and of the Islamic Republic of Iran to take strikes against the US military and diplomatic presence in Iraq? Well, there's a lot going on here, but there's at least two reasons that I think are relevant. From a militia standpoint, these strikes are designed to force the United States to withdraw its troops from Iraq. Our troops are there for the counter-ISIS mission, but they also project diplomatic heft. And Iran and its proxies don't want the United States to have a meaningful diplomatic presence in Iran's backyard. Which brings us to the Iranian regime's value calculus. From Iran's standpoint, these strikes are kinetic diplomacy. The attacks are taking place against the backdrop of negotiations in Vienna over Iran's nuclear program, and the regime in Tehran calculates that kinetic pressure against American soldiers and diplomats is a way of gaining leverage in those talks. So what do we do about it? I think the easy answer, and it's the right answer, is we need to establish deterrence against these groups and their patrons in Iran. Again, that is a lot harder than it sounds. The Biden administration will want to use, or credibly threaten to use, a sufficient amount of force that's capable of preventing the militias from continuing this violent course of action. And at the same time, the administration seemingly wants to avoid escalation. One of the problems here is that the desire to avoid escalation seems to be asymmetric. Iran and its proxies don't appear to fear escalation in the way the United States does. And indeed, Iran and its proxies may actually welcome escalation because they could use a forceful United States response to agitate for the expulsion of American forces from Iraq. So the current situation is actually one in which Iran appears to be deterring the United States rather than one in which the United States is deterring Iran. And that is not an acceptable or tenable situation. So how do we change that dynamic? There's a menu of options that policymakers could consider, not recommending any particular one or combination of them, especially not in the context of particular strikes, but these are the sorts of things that policymakers would probably want to consider. So one thing you can do is increase the tempo of American retaliatory strikes. Since January, I think the US has taken 2 strikes against these Iran-backed militias, compared to the dozens and dozens of strikes that the militias have taken against us. That's not a good ratio. That ratio is not going to deter the bad guys. Another thing you might consider doing is increasing the seniority of the targets in the crosshairs. So far, the United States has taken off the battlefield some relatively low-level foot soldiers. That's probably not going to deter the militias. The militia leaders see these guys as expendable cannon fodder. So one thing you might consider doing is climbing the hierarchy of the militia rosters, and putting some of the middle management or leadership at personal risk if they continue to undertake strikes against our soldiers and diplomats. Another thing you might consider doing is expand the targets from just the militia leaders to include some of the Iranian enablers who are on the ground in Syria or in Iraq. Thinking, for example, of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force leaders who are there pulling the strings, as it were, behind the militias. And another thing you might consider doing is unattributed strikes. The default is that after the US retaliates, we put out a press release and say the United States launched X number of missiles or X number of drones at this target in this location. We might take a page out of the Israeli playbook and simply decline to comment. And we have a number of covert action authorities on the books that would allow us to do something like that. The advantage there would be to lessen the pressure on the Iraqi government to respond to what many people in Iraq will see as an affront to Iraqi sovereignty. And then last thing you might consider doing, shut down the nuke talks. Why should the United States engage in diplomacy with Iran in Vienna when Iran is actively trying to slaughter our soldiers and diplomats? Send a clear signal that that's out of bounds, that's a red line for us. And if you're serious about improving relations, one way to improve relations is not launch rockets at us. Finally, we're almost out of time here, and I want to get into the Q&A, which is always the most fun. Let me shift for a couple of seconds to the China topic. I'll plug another book by my friend Josh Rogan. It's called Chaos Under Heaven. It just came out a couple of weeks or months ago, and it describes the Trump administration's evolving approach to China from 17 up into 21. We all know that we've entered a new era of great power competition. For the past couple of decades, counterterrorism has really been the preeminent US foreign policy and national security priority. That's now changing, and grappling with the implications of a rising and aggressive Chinese Communist Party is really going to be consuming the bulk of policymaker bandwidth for the foreseeable future. Now that's a big topic. I just want to flag one small piece of it that I think bears watching, and that is the implications of this new era for private businesses. I think private companies, particularly American and other Western companies, increasingly are going to find themselves caught in the crossfire between Washington and Beijing. Now, for decades, Western businesses could basically have their cake and eat it too. They could do business in China based on the assumption that increased economic engagement would lead to economic liberalization, which in turn would lead to political liberalization. That's no longer the case. Instead, we're much more aware today of the risks that economic engagement could enable Chinese Communist Party abuses, such as the genocide in Xinjiang province against Muslim Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities. So what we're seeing is the United States and our allies increasingly using human rights sanctions to impose costs on Beijing. Beijing is responding to this by recently adopting a new law that authorizes so-called blocking sanctions. What that means is imposing sanctions on probably Western companies if they change their behavior in response to or to comply with US or Western sanctions on Chinese human rights abuses. So watch this space. It promises to be interesting and full of action. With that, Chris, back over to you, and look forward to a conversation.
Hey, Nathan, thank you very much. Now everyone knows why we asked you to join us on Spy Chat. That was really a great articulation of three really, really tough problems. So I'm going to kick it over to Amanda. I think you've got some questions for
I,
us, and
I,
just the fun part of the program.
yeah, I definitely do. I don't know if this one is fun, but do you see the U.S. needing to go back into Afghanistan using that middle ground approach?
Uh, Chris, is that for you or is that for me?
I think you go ahead, take a stab at it, and I'll follow on.
It's really hard to say. We have seen that pattern play out before in the past, and it's one we all want to avoid. And I'm thinking here of Iraq. U.S. withdrew its forces in the Obama administration. Several years later, after the rise of ISIS, we're back in. So I think one of the lessons we have to take from that is, for the investment of a very small amount of American treasure and hopefully no blood at all, you can maintain conditions that prevent the rise of terrorist groups that would necessitate a much larger and much more costly American intervention 2 or 3 years down the road. Now, it's impossible to predict what Afghanistan is going to look like in 6 months, a year, let alone 4 years from now. But my hope is that history doesn't repeat itself.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. I agree with your assessment there. I will add just a bit of a thought experiment. I saw the question, I jotted down some notes, and I truly hope I'm wrong. But if there's a Taliban-led government at some point in time, I suspect the greatest interest from a U.S. standpoint will be, as you've articulated, the necessity to ensure that there aren't spaces for terrorist planning, on the ground sanctuary, if you will, which brought us to Afghanistan in the first place in 2001. In that eventuality, I think there are several options. One is the idea of over the horizon operations is going to be challenging, but we still have strike capabilities to go after ISIS if they consolidate. Similarly, we can do the same thing with Al-Qaeda, although the Taliban has offered assurances during the talks that they will prevent that from happening. I'm not sure they can be trusted. That said, there are other options which really aren't the middle ground, but it will be, again, history repeating itself somewhat, and that is small teams of special operations forces and intelligence services linking on the ground with militias that have a willingness to go after our nation's adversaries that pose a threat to the United States. But the broader issue is to step back and realize that there are going to be significant humanitarian consequences. You know better than I do what those humanitarian consequences can be. So this is going to be an international problem because I don't believe that the United States is interested in going back and reassessing a greater force posture and deployment of U.S. forces into Afghanistan. That's complex. There's no national will to do that. And it's a burden greater than the United States can bear after 20 years at war. So that's how I would address that question. It's an excellent question. It's a tough question.
And if Chris, I agree with everything you just said. And if I could just jump in on one small piece of that real quickly, the Taliban promised the Trump administration and the Biden administration that they're going to break with Al-Qaeda. That was one of the conditions for the U.S. to withdraw its forces from Afghanistan. I don't have a whole lot of confidence that the Taliban is going to honor their commitments. Let me just put it that way. Based on what we're seeing in public source reporting, the UN had a report about this several weeks ago, or maybe longer now. The relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda has persisted. I think it's likely to persist. So it's something that we're going to have to keep a very, very close eye on. And then ultimately policymakers will have to decide if the threat situation has gotten to the point to warrant US action.
We have a very interesting question from a frequent guest. How feasible and effective do you think persistent cyber attacks against Iran? will be, could be, are?
Great question. I guess it all depends on who's doing them, us or Israel. One of the really remarkable things we've seen over the past 6 months, probably longer, is how accident prone key sectors of the Iranian economy and military can be. Maybe I should say accident prone. The largest vessel in the Iranian Navy caught fire. We've seen accidents at facilities associated with the Iranian nuclear weapons program. And what all this signals to me is that certain foreign powers that take a dim view of the Iranian regime's malign activity have been incredibly effective at penetrating Iran, whether using human assets or, as the questioner is alluding to, using cyber capabilities. But I'm not sure who's responsible here, but I do notice that every time something bad happens in Iran, the Mossad's Twitter account does some first-rate trolling. The other day, there were, I think it was the Iranian countdown clock to the destruction of Israel suddenly went dark, and the Mossad was like, we're bored. What could we put on the Iranian countdown clock for the destruction of Israel? First-rate Twitter trolling. Anyway, the question is really, how effective are these things? And, I think they're effective on a couple of different levels. One is it's a constant nuisance, and it's also kind of embarrassing for any country to see its most sensitive military technologies and nuclear capabilities disrupted with regularity and seemingly with impunity. So in addition to the sort of reputational harm that these attacks inflict on Iran, it also has operational consequences. They really do set back the regime's ability to progress towards a nuclear weapon. A good example of that, of course, is the Stuxnet bug from, gosh, almost a decade ago now, maybe longer. I forget what the intelligence assessments were. I was just reading about them in the newspaper at the time, so this isn't any insider knowledge, but set back the regime's nuclear ambitions by months, by years. So I think these sorts of cyber intrusions really do have, not just symbolic effects, but some practical consequences as well.
I just add on, Ambassador, to that question. I would just make the point that stepping back, and you've alluded to it, there is a shadow war that is ongoing between Israel and Iran. It's happening at sea. There's been a tit for tat on the open water. There have been ships that have been sabotaged, not sunk very deliberately. It's become a nuisance, a back and forth, a tit for tat. So I view right now Iran's capabilities as that of at the nuisance level. They understand, I think, that Israel in particular and the United States have robust attack capabilities in the cyber realm. And I'm not speaking from any insider knowledge. That's not my expertise, but I think all of that serves as a deterrence. But the broader point is there is a shadow war that is ongoing. And the ambassador made the point that includes surrogates and proxies and force short of things happening in a catastrophic way, just a nuisance, a tit for tat. But make no mistake, there are Americans and Westerners at risk on the ground in Iraq, caught up in this back and forth. And, the administration recently retaliated because of some of these strikes. So it's something we need to watch very, very closely, but it has been ongoing for decades.
So we have a couple of directions we're going to go in, but we have a VIP guest. So we're going to stick with cyber for a minute because, Chris, this is your favorite questioner, Rose, who you've met in person recently. She wants me to say hi to you. Rose is a budding intelligence professional who is not yet a teenager, I believe. And she wants to know Does international law apply to cyber conflict, and does it fit under the UN Chapter Article 2 for a threat use of force? That's our Rose. She's brilliant.
So, Rose, it's great to hear from you. That is a phenomenal question. And I really, really don't have, I can't give you the clarity that I would like to. So I'm going to have to research a bit. But I will say that whatever responses from the United States are that that are used to go after our adversaries will need to be proportional and will be in line with the right of a state to retaliate, in a self-defensive posture. But beyond that, I really cannot comment on the legal strictures. That's really, really a solid question. Nathan, maybe you can help me out on that one.
Yeah, great question, Rose. Back when I was a law professor, that's the sort of question that I would have used to torture my students on their final exam, because it's really hard. The short answer is I don't think anybody really knows what the answer is. The way international norms regarding the use of force have traditionally evolved is for humanity to develop a certain amount of experience using a certain type of munition, and for the costs of that munition to become apparent to everybody, such that regulation of it in a particular way is a consensus approach. Everybody agrees with the need to ban, mines or chemical weapons or various other munitions. I don't think we're yet at the stage of our experience with cyber weapons where any kind of international consensus exists. And so I think what we're going to be in for over the next couple of years or couple of decades maybe is states are going to experiment. And out of that cycle of intrusion and retaliation, something like a rough consensus regarding what kinds of uses are acceptable and what kinds of uses are not will eventually emerge. But I don't think we're there yet.
All right, we have some questions about economic sanctions, and if you had any thought about the sanctions, if you want to have any comment on President Trump's parting move with economic sanctions against China and certain businesses in China, how effective, or what you thought of that.
Sure. So, the previous administration really made sanctions one of its central foreign policy and national security tools, not just with respect to China and not just with respect to human rights, but a lot of these trends converged in very visible ways over human rights concerns in the PRC. I think one of the things that's really striking about the Biden administration's approach to China and sanctions in particular is there's an awful lot of continuity between the two administrations, and that's sort of a counterintuitive thing. Like you wouldn't necessarily expect the incoming Biden administration to pick up the baton and continue running when it comes to a Trump administration foreign policy priority. But when it comes to China, I think we've actually seen a fair amount of continuity. The rhetorical temperature has been lowered, and frankly, I think that's probably a good thing. But when you look at the actual actions that Treasury is taking, or Customs is taking, or the Commerce Department is taking, we're still seeing the use of, for example, global Magnitsky sanctions to sanction CCP members who are committing human rights abuses in Xinjiang or in Hong Kong. We're still seeing the Commerce Department put certain companies on the so-called entities list to prevent American companies from exporting sensitive technologies to China that the CCP might use to conduct abusive surveillance or other human rights violations. And we're still seeing the US Customs use a tool called WROs, or withhold release orders, to prevent the importation of certain goods from China that we fear might be tainted by forced labor or human rights violations. There was a recent action involving polysilicon coming out of Xinjiang province, where the genocide is underway. So I think the previous administration really established the proof of concept that economic sanctions can be an incredibly powerful tool, an incredibly powerful piece of leverage for the United States to pursue its geopolitical objectives, and to do it, moreover, in consultation with and in lockstep with our Western partners, particularly NATO allies and the EU. And I think the Biden administration, despite a very different rhetorical tone, is following a very, very similar path when it comes to the use of these tools.
Yeah, so the ambassador did a great job of articulating sanctions against China and the value of it, and in particular, the continuity. I would just underscore there is a continuity and a range of ways with China, diplomatically, information, things like calling out genocide, as the ambassador alluded to, in particular, focusing on Uyghurs, not just Uyghurs in the province, but Uyghurs across the world that are suffering from attacks and surveillance. So all of this really equates to accountability from the United States, and in a larger sense from the international community. And this always avoids what we hope to prevent, and that is a military clash, right? So use diplomacy, information, use economic, meaning sanctions, and continue to put a different kind of pressure on China. And I really do appreciate that there is a level of continuity, which I think is healthy long term. If we're going to live in this world with China for a long time, we're going to have to figure out how to continue to coexist.
One guest wonders, in light of the way that China is being handled, how does that make you feel about U.S. current and historical policy towards Cuba?
Yeah, so Cuba has been probably the Western Hemisphere's principal source of human rights violations for the past 5 decades. But we've got our eye on you, Venezuela, because we see you're making a heck of a run to take the title from Cuba. So I guess one way to refine the question is to ask, how effective have U.S. sanctions against Cuba been? And there's a sense in which people might say, well, look, the Castro regime is still in place in Cuba. The human rights violations continue despite U.S. economic pressure. So those sanctions are a failure. I don't really see it that way. I see the sanctions that a bipartisan group of American presidents and American congresspeople have favored for years. I see those sanctions as advancing 2 specific benefits. The first practical one is do no harm. By limiting the resources available to the communist regime in Havana, we limit the regime's ability to inflict harm on its own people, and we limit its ability to inflict harm on its neighbors, such as the long-suffering people of Venezuela. Is it reduced to zero? No, of course not. The dictatorship will continue to do atrocities at home and to promote them abroad. But its ability to do that is diminished by the effect of sanctions taking money out of their coffers. And I think another value of sanctions with respect to Cuba is the sort of hortatory or messaging value. By continuing to keep human rights related sanctions on Cuba on the forefront of people's minds, it reminds people of the terrible abuses that continue to take place there. Security forces rounding up ladies in white after mass when they seek to peacefully protest and beating them to a pulp. The Cuban doctors program, which gets great press, but ultimately relies on forced labor where doctors in Cuba are conscripted into service by the state and sent abroad. The money they make is then appropriated by the state. And while these folks are abroad treating patients, their families are back home, essentially being held hostage by the regime to dissuade them from defecting or speaking out. The more that the United States can do through sanctions and other tools to shine a light on these human rights violations right across the strait from Florida, the better, in my mind.
Go ahead, Amanda.
All right. We've got two more. This is a big one. What role can we expect Iran to play in Afghanistan after US withdrawal? And I told you there were two questions because we could spend an hour on that one. But
yeah, that's a great question. And I think my answer is a harmful role. Because when you look at how Iran does business in other countries, a pattern of violence and destruction and destabilization is really what emerges. Take Lebanon, for example. Iran has lavishly bankrolled the Lebanese terrorist group Hezbollah for several decades, to the point where Hezbollah has become effectively a state within a state. It's corrupt, it leeches resources away from the Lebanese people and repurposes them for its own malign agenda. Lebanon has basically been destroyed by Hezbollah and by its Iranian patrons. We're seeing something similar in Syria, where Iran has propped up the bloody Assad dictatorship for going on a decade now, including its use of chemical weapons against its own people and children as well, who've been deliberately targeted for death and destruction by the regime's chemical weapons. In Yemen, the Houthi rebels have received a great deal of support, both financial, rhetorical, and weapons from Tehran. And they've managed to bring Yemen to the brink of famine and starvation. So the pattern that emerges is where the Islamic Republic of Iran touches the world suffers. Anything that Iran is going to do in Afghanistan after the US leaves is going to be harmful. It's going to be harmful for the Afghan people, and it's going to be harmful for the region.
Yeah, I don't have a lot more to add other than to say that Iran's role is to be a disruptor, and they're going to exploit power vacuums. And I expect Hezbollah will have a role even on the ground in Afghanistan at some level. If not Hezbollah, then certainly Quds Force organizations, Iranian special operations, intelligence services. All of this is in line with an Iran regional playbook that they've exploited this kind of environment from Syria to Lebanon. And as the ambassador said, Yemen is a great model. Take a look at Yemen and what has happened on the ground with Houthis. So I agree.
all right. People noticed, Chris Costa, that you dropped a hint about the book Drop of Treason, Phil Agee's story, that you had perhaps a personal comment to make about the Agee case.
No, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about books anytime. I was too young to appreciate the nuance of Philip Agee's book, which caused the stir, a sensation. I think in the 1970s, the book was published, and of course, it was a tell-all memoir, and it was an anti-CIA book. If Agee wanted to turn the world against the CIA, he didn't do it in my mind, because I read the book and I was very young, but I was animated by the idea of working intelligence issues, human intelligence, and he also provided some insights that I don't normally talk about, so I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about on the training facilities and what it takes to be a case officer. And I was very, very much excited about what I understood about that book. And over time, I came to appreciate, of course, as I grew older, that although his book, which was titled "In the CIA Diary," I believe, was Agee's book, it really just animated my interest in the intelligence community. So AG failed with Chris Costa because for me, it was an exciting discipline to pursue and study.
It
And
was a recruit. It sounds like it was a recruitment tool for Chris Costa, which
right,
that is so
which is
interesting.
absolutely counterintuitive.
Right.
But I should say the book, and I don't know if I mentioned the title, but I think you, A Drop of Treason, really provided the backstory to a G. And for me, it was really exciting to read the backstory and to hear the author's perspective. It's a narrative worth reading. And I would say also, parenthetically, Jonathan Stevenson, the author, I think he's in DC. He was one of my college professors at the
Oh,
Naval War College, and I thought he was a very good professor.
very cool.
Are we wrapping up now, Amanda?
Well, we can. I was going to ask you about the events in Haiti, if either of you
Oh,
wanted to comment on the assassination of Moise before I officially wrap up.
so I can jump in there just to give Nathan a break and let him have the final word. So from my standpoint, I love this question because we don't know what the truth is right now, but
Mhm.
it seems that uh, that the government is talking about mercenaries. So in other words, some armed group was unhappy with the president. The president, if I understand the situation on the ground in Haiti, has extended his tenure on the ground in Haiti. That's a very unpopular decision. So he's maintaining a power hold. And the broader story on the ground in Haiti is one, significant economic problems. They receive significant aid from the United States, a very strong diaspora community of Haitians in Florida and across the United States. So we have long ties on the ground with Haiti. We almost executed an invasion there several decades ago. And the bottom line is the country hasn't bounced back from an earthquake in 2010. So it seemed that this armed group was posing maybe as DEA agents. I think with confidence, I can absolutely ensure our listeners that the DEA had nothing to do with this. This was a bit of a false flag operation, might have opened the doors, so to speak, looking like US DEA was on the ground. Certainly it was not. So it's a politically driven assassination. I will say my analysis is that this might be related to transnational gangs. There are transnational gangs that operate very successfully and are linked to politicians in Central America. So I would not doubt if there is a nexus to transnational gangs, and there's a tie to essentially criminal organizations. So it's a scary situation on the ground for Haitians, and we'll see how it all plays out.
Any comment on that, Nathan? And no need, if not.
I couldn't improve on anything Chris just said.
That was, I learned a lot. So thank you for that, Chris. And thank you so much, Chris and Nathan. This has been so interesting and wide ranging, and really appreciate your both being here. And we want to thank Mary Beth Long again for her incredible support of Spy Chat and the Spy Museum. We look forward to seeing folks in the museum, which is open, or at our next online program, which is Monday, July 26th at noon. And our curator, Dr. Andrew Hammond, will be discussing Sleeper Agent, and that is about a very interesting atomic spy. So not current, but very interesting. So we have lots of cool programs coming up, including a spy camp that is happening next week virtually for the younger set. So check out our website to learn about all these programs. And if you know me, you know I'm going to say, if you are appreciating these programs or the Spy Museum, please don't hesitate to contribute to the Spy Museum. We really appreciate your help and support, and we look forward to seeing you in person and online.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Amanda, thanks for closing out this tremendous session. And thanks to our guests and our staff, Hannah and Shauna and a bunch of other people that contribute to this every month. I'm really excited about how this spy chat went. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Nathan.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Amanda. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I appreciate your time.